Well, welcome everybody to one of CBERT's webinars in our series for the year. This is working with children with IDDs in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, service provider perspectives with Doug Gomez. Typically, we have our amazing Amanda Perez running these webinars, but she's taking some much needed vacation, and Matt and I are filling in. So please have some patience with us if it doesn't go quite as smoothly as usual. We're going to try. Couple little nuggets of information. One, if you don't know me, I'm Melissa McCart, and I oversee the Oregon TBI teams. And then we have the amazing Matt Dawson logged in as Amanda Perez. He is part of our support team at CBERT, who helps make all of this possible. Quick couple notes. One, you should all be on mute. If you're not on mute, we are going to manually mute you, just so if anybody's kids are home or dogs, or, in my case, the doorbell rings, whatever, it's hard to do these kind of presentations as it is, but even harder with a lot of background noise. And so we try to mitigate that so our speakers can focus. If you have questions, please post them in the chat function. You should see that down at the bottom of your screen. There's also a Q&A function. Matt and I will both be monitoring that and making sure that either your questions are answered in real time by our presenter, or by Matt or I if we have the information that you're asking for. So please make sure that you put those questions in there as you think of them, not wait till the end, because we want to make sure that your questions don't get forgotten. They're important to us, and they help us, one, create interactivity in this webinar and help keep everyone's attention with a screen presentation, but they also help us think about what we are going to provide as content for the next webinars. We do have a live closed caption option. We do not have it on right now because it's pretty error prone, but if you're somebody who would like us to do that, please send either Matt or I a private message and we'll get it turned on. Trying to think if there's any other nuts and bolts. Doug is going to shoot to be done at about 1:45 to have time for questions. So if you're planning your day around that, that would be good to know. Did I miss anything, Matt?
I don't think so. That sounds about right.
Okay, so let's officially kick this off. I'm going to introduce Doug Gomez to you all, and he has to tolerate me reading his bio. So Doug is a research associate at the Center on Brain Injury Research and Training. He is interested in qualitative methods and analysis, particularly in the service of benefiting traditionally underserved populations. Doug has a lot of experience in that. He currently consults at CBERT on multiple studies with qualitative components, with the goal of reaching better understanding about how parents, educators, coaches, and medical professionals can help facilitate improved services for individuals who have sustained a TBI. He is also a trained counseling psychologist with experience working clinically in state hospital and correctional settings. And so Doug has a lot of amazing experience, and we're so happy to have him as a new member of the CBERT team, but also as a presenter for our webinars. And on that note, Doug, you're up.
All right. Thank you very much, Melissa. I appreciate it. So as you all know, today I'm going to be talking about working with children with IDDs and originally it was in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. I definitely went ahead and changed that this morning because we are absolutely still in the midst of the pandemic. And so we're really going to be talking about service provider perspectives, and particularly in the context of a study that we've been kind of working on for the last 3-4 months now. So I kind of wanted to present some preliminary data to folks, see what people think, and then go from there. All right, so the first way we need to talk about the study is we need to talk about this TOTS original study. So I'll give folks some experience with that. Essentially, children with intellectual or developmental disability are likely to experience challenges with behavior due to difficulties with communication, self-regulation, co-occurring medical or sensory impairments, a lot of potentially environmental factors as well. We know that caregivers benefit from receiving services from individuals who specialize in early intervention to address some of those concerns, and that many of those caregivers just don't receive those services that are possible due to lack of awareness, lack of education, even like lack of availability of the services themselves. So that's kind of just some like lit background. And so the TOTS program, it has, we've got the principal investigator is Laura Lee McIntyre. The program TOTS actually stands for Tiered Online Training and Support. So it's a web-based model that uses evidence-based interventions to provide education and support to caregivers in order to help them manage behavioral challenges in home and community settings. So that's the original TOTS project. And so it has 3 phases. There's the adaptation phase where we're gathering data from stakeholders to inform the usability of the intervention. That's what we're doing right now. And I'll talk more about why this sort of, this COVID study got started, but that's the phase we're in now. And then once we've really, tweaked the intervention so that we think it's going to work, we're going to do a randomized control trial. And then lastly, we'll get the intervention out to the public. That's like the phases that we're going to be going into. And so that leads us to the current study. So due to the pandemic, research protocols needed to be amended in order to account for changes in service provision. So we looked at our advisory panel and we talked all about how services were provided. And then the pandemic hit and everything changed. And so we really wanted to address methods of intervention that needed to be modified. And then again, follow up with stakeholders and service providers to make sure the information is representative of what's actually happening currently. And so we've got the actual study. Essentially, it's experienced researchers interviewed these early intervention providers to just better understand their experiences during the pandemic. And so we had some experts, from the original TOTS program. We had an undergrad student and a graduate student who actually were the folks that performed many of the interviews. And these interviews were with EI specialists, school psychologists. We had a couple of administrators, so folks who really were in charge of a lot of the different EI services that went on. We had a social worker or 2 and a few speech language therapists. And so one thing to also note about this study is that we were actually doing these interviews with folks from Oregon and from Ohio. And so we had a connection in Ohio as a function of the TOTS program. And we thought, okay, great, let's get a couple of different places, because the type of work that's going to be done in Oregon is going to be very different than the work that was done in Ohio as well. So now we'll get into my favorite part, which is talking about the actual just methods and what went on in the study. So please stop me and ask questions if you have questions about any part of this, but I'll go ahead and get started. So these were semi-structured individual interviews. And so as I mentioned, we had 2 members of the research team who were the folks doing the actual interviews. It's actually unfortunate. I always think about this, like the further along you get in your field, the less you're actually able to do the really fun parts of research, which for me would have been the interviews. So I did a lot of training. We did a lot of discussion about, okay, what kinds of things are going to come up in the interviews, and talked about the protocols. But unfortunately, my role ended up being a lot of the analysis of the interviews, and I didn't get to actually perform them, which is unfortunate. So with that, we've also got we basically used consensual qualitative research to analyze the results. This is one of my favorite ways to do it. And the main reason, the only way that you can do consensual qualitative research is if you have a group of people. You actually have to have like a group of researchers who are interested in doing the analysis, not one person like myself who does all the analysis and then presents it to the group. So we had this really awesome group of 4 or 5 folks who wanted to go over the data. And so we did it all together, and we'd have these meetings once or twice a week, usually on Wednesdays, where we would, once an interview had been completed, we'd all have time to go over the interview ourselves, become familiar with the data, and then start to generate these, what we'd call domains, which are basically like these larger themes about what's coming up in the data. And we'll see a couple of these later, what these domains look like. at the same time, we're generating these core ideas, which are really small bits of data that show up. And then lastly, we start to come up with, okay, we've got a feel for what the big ideas are. We've got a feel for what the really small ones are. What are the relations between those? And we come up with the cross analysis, or what we call the themes. And so we did that all together. As I said, we'd come up with everything in a group. And then what would happen is after each meeting, I'd be taking notes on everything that was discussed, each little theme one by one, even each little core idea. And then at the end of the whole process, I came back to the group and said, okay, here are the types of themes that we've come up with. What do you all think? And then we discuss them there. And the reason it's called consensual qualitative research is that if I have an idea that's very different about what's coming out from these interviews than somebody else in the group, we've got to come to consensus, which can be enjoyable and can also be difficult because people have a whole lot of different conceptualizations of data, especially when we're reading things with our own experiences in mind. And so what that consensus looks like is we talk for a whole long time, and then at a certain point we're like, okay, I think it's like this. If we have this full disagreement, I think it's like this other way as well. We'll keep both, and then we'll move on from there. The last step, obviously, being writing out the data and producing a report. So that's sort of the way that the analysis process went. And then what I would like to do is just talk to you all about some of these preliminary bits of data that we actually got. Okay, so I called these themes, they're the result of the cross analysis essentially. And so we have these few right here with some sub themes as well. So I'll just kind of talk a little bit about them here. And then I'm also going to go into these really specific examples from the data of quotes from these service professionals so that they can use their own words to explain what I'm trying to talk about now. So we obviously, one of the first themes that one would expect to see when you're interviewing these professionals is that there are some negative aspects of COVID-19 related to both their work and their personal lives as well. We saw quite a few examples of how the pandemic has affected the way that people are able to actually provide services. We saw quite a few examples of how people's personal lives were affected, and then thus it affects their work as well. We also saw, though, and this was something that, I added the word unexpected because it's relatively unexpected, that there were some positive aspects of, or as a result of, the pandemic as well. And those were both personal and professional. I'll get into some of the examples, but personal might be like an opportunity to spend more time with family. And then professionally, this sub theme was really key and was one of the cooler themes that came out, which is when folks were faced with professional difficulty, they found really, really cool ways of coping. And so that would be through creativity, which would be like examples of creative ways to provide interventions, because obviously a lot of the work that's being done is no longer live. And for somebody who maybe spends 90% of their job in a classroom trying to use early interventions, them being actually at home and using teletherapy and using Zoom, it actually creates a situation where they have to be creative. Otherwise, they can't get work done. And so I'll go into a couple of those examples, but a good one would be just like a person who's providing an intervention where, mainly it would be maybe like a modeling intervention where I go in and say, okay, here's the way that I would want you to interact with your child for parents. And then actually having to change that because I'm no longer the person who's able to actually do that intervention. I've got to coach parents on how to do it. We also found that folks were very flexible with the way that they coped with professional difficulty and ultimately resilient as well. The third theme is this idea of increased parent involvement. And so I guess one way to think about it, and one way that we were thinking about it originally was, well, yeah, parent involvement is great, right? So that would be one of these unexpected positive aspects of COVID-19. But the reason that we split it off was actually because parent involvement can be a bit of what we were calling like a double-edged sword, in that it's great to get parents involved, especially if we weren't able to do it as well previously. And it's exhausting. It's exhausting for these parents. It's exhausting for these providers because these are new ways that we have of interacting. And we really didn't want to, and these providers really didn't want these parents to burn out. And so increased parent involvement actually has multiple ways that you can look at it. One of the cool sub-themes from this larger idea was actually that there are some benefits of pre-established relationships. And so providers basically noticed that, look, the people that I knew beforehand and that I was working with in a variety of different capacities were the people who were more likely to engage in services once we're having to do teletherapy and once we're having to change the way that things go. And so there were some pretty relevant, significant examples of, all right, like people I know already are the ones who are engaging in these services. We also found that through increased parent involvement, we noticed that a lot of these providers were talking about coaching and what does coaching mean to them? And coaching has multiple definitions. So the kind of traditional definition that some of our folks on our research team who work in early intervention talked about was like, basically as a coach, you're watching a parent interact with a child, and then you might be outside the room, you might not be directly involved in the interaction itself, but you're able to actually coach the parent through, okay, here's how you should respond when your child is tantruming, or when your child is not listening or not being engaged in whatever behavior you're trying to get them to do. And so that would be kind of a formalized outside version of coaching. And then what these folks were also talking about was coaching in that just talking to parents more and realizing that sometimes it's really hard to get, and we'll see with this first quote actually, sometimes it's really hard to get a 4 or 5 year old sitting in front of a screen for any extended period of time. And so the intervention that normally would be with the child actually ends up being primarily with the parent, and you're coaching to let them know, what sorts of things they can do that can be helpful. And then lastly, the last theme that we got, our alliterative theme, is post-pandemic predictions. And so a lot of these providers basically just talked about how they thought things were going to go after the pandemic ends, assuming that it ends in a timely manner. What things are going to stick around, what things are going to be changes that may actually change the field. And we'll talk about those as well. So if I have any questions about those themes, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, I'll start getting into some of the specific examples. All right.
It looks like no questions, Doug.
All right, cool. So let's see here. So we had the negative aspects of COVID-19. All right, so one of the quotes was, I would say I'm not seeing very many kids who are under 6. I'm not doing a lot of one-on-one teletherapy with them for obvious reasons. So instead, it's more parent coaching and parent sessions, which has its benefits too. So this type of quote was representative of over half of the people that we talked to had something similar to this. And what they're saying is, again, getting a kid who's very young in front of a camera for any extended period of time is really difficult. And so it changes the way that I have to provide interventions. And again, the reason we coded this and we discussed this under negative aspects of COVID-19 is for a lot of folks, they aren't trained as well as they would like to be in providing interventions to parents. They're used to providing intervention to kids. And so it was a very difficult thing for them to have to switch their entire way of being. And they learned quite a bit, which is another kind of potentially positive aspect that I'll talk about. So another example professionally is this quote, I'm actually, I guess, unpleasantly surprised at how draining it could be to only do virtual. Like I said, I've always kind of been a pro telehealth person, but I'm like, I need some in-person sessions. I need to have some time where we sit on the floor and look at the same toy in the same space. We heard quite a bit about how draining it can be. Everyone kind of feels like they're zoomed out to an extent, and especially these providers who this is the main way that they communicate with their folks they're working with. It was certainly a negative aspect of the pandemic, is that they're being drained and in a very different way than they're used to. So this last little one is actually one of the examples of the more personal negative aspects of COVID-19. So this quote is, I would say that what's been most difficult is the not knowing things are going to change from day to day, from minute to minute, not knowing if me or one of my family members is going to get sick or is sick, not knowing what school is going to look like in the fall. So again, the reason I included this one is we heard a whole lot about how One of the most difficult things is just not knowing how this is going to end, what things are going to look like. This was actually an interview that was earlier on, so in June. In September, I want to say, we did some more interviews and we still heard the same thing. Even people who knew, like, all right, we're going back to school. Here's the way that we're going to provide these interventions. We've been doing it for a couple of months. Still, this not knowing really had a strong effect on folks personally related to the pandemic. So this next one is unexpected positive aspects of COVID-19. And I want to read this first quote. I think this was one of my favorites. So this is going to be the new norm. I just think it's given us the opportunity to look back at our evidence-based practices, and I got comfortable because what we've been doing this for over 11 years, evidence-based practice with the primary service providers, just tightening up some things that we kind of gotten loose about. Agendas, meetings, why are we doing this? Are we doing it to the extent of what we said we were going to do 10 years ago, making us reevaluate our practice? So this was one of the more significant quotes itself. This quote was great, but also, again, it was representative of over 50% of the data. These folks were saying, look, we had to reevaluate what we were doing, and it actually forced us to. So time and time again, I find myself clinically, you go into the office, you see the same types of folks that you saw, you'd write your notes, you'd go to lunch, you'd come back. Like, there was this whole cycle, and it was the same thing over and over again. And what these folks were saying was actually having to stop and analyze our practices and, like, is this thing working? Am I still doing what I wanted to be doing, 10 years ago? Was a really helpful thing. And it made some significant changes that I'll talk more about in these post-pandemic predictions as well. Another example here would be a more personal positive aspect of COVID, which is that folks were saying that I've been really fortunate in this situation. I'm self-employed. I can be flexible in terms of meeting the needs of family, having work life be designed around that. Also fortunate, I have a husband who's self-employed and we only have one kid. Basically, people saying they had an opportunity to spend more time with family and that there are some positives as a result, including some of the flexibility to who takes what kid to what, like, when do you have time to spend time together? These are things that at the very least have changed as a result of the pandemic. And so some of these providers were saying, yeah, we've noticed that as well. This last little bit is this coping with professional difficulty sub-theme. So I'll give an example here. This was a provider who was asked, do you actually give advice to parents? Like, I think the question was something along the lines of, do you give advice to parents about what to do when you're at home versus, like, this was somebody who primarily did a lot of the interventions at school. And so the provider said, like the sneaky back doorway, right? Like, I'm telling them, so during mealtime, you're going to do this or that. Maybe you could try this. And if you happen to have these 3 items at home, then you can make a game around this. So these were some examples of folks having to be creative and rising to the challenge. For somebody who works primarily in the classroom and is trying to change behaviors in the classroom for some of these kids, trying to figure out how to do it at home is a little different. And, if you don't have the same items that you're used to, and also you're the person who's, again, you're no longer able to model these behaviors in the same way because you're not in the same room and can't have the parent watching. You have to teach parents how to do it using your words and using, the tone of your voice and all these different things that we use through teletherapy. And folks were really creative about that as well. All right. So again, this third theme that we noticed was increased parent involvement. And so this was a provider who was talking about an interaction that this provider had with the parent afterwards. And so talking about the parent, she said before, I didn't look at it as work because you were coming to me and you were in my home and you were doing it. She said, now I have to show you how I'm doing it is using techniques. But we're at home so much, I feel like I need to do it, she said. And so she was like, this is really work. She looked at it like that. She said, because you all make it look so easy. And so again, this was a parent talking to this provider saying, you come in and you do the work and it's incredible. And, sometimes we have just you're the main person doing these interventions with my kid day to day, week to week. And maybe I tell you that I'm doing what you're asking me to do, but the reality is that the person who's mainly working with the kid is you. And then recognizing like, this is real work. This parent saying, this is real work, and telling the provider, like, this was tough to do. And I'm noticing it. So there's definitely more increased parent involvement as a result of the pandemic. This sub-theme here, benefits of pre-established relationships. So an example quote was, the parents that are already engaged and already in communication in those situations tend to be the parents that make more of the effort to access the lessons, access the opportunities, rather than the parents that aren't engaged to begin with. And that's my biggest concern about not going back in person in the beginning of the school year. If you don't have that relationship and that ability to build that relationship and that communication, it's going to be even harder to try and engage those parents. So we saw this theme repeated over and over again. Providers who had better relationships with parents beforehand seemed to, that relationship obviously transferred over. I will say, and again, this is anecdotal, but it's from sort of my clinical experience. Working in the hospital, I was in the hospital for a year last year. And so I was part of this cohort, and I was with a bunch of other psychology interns in all these other locations. And the more I talked to them, the more that I heard like the same concern that, oh, I'm really worried because I'm having to start these relationships via the computer. And I don't have these personal relationships beforehand that are kind of going to bolster that rapport and that relationship. But the longer this went on and the more that I talked to people, the more that I realized, and they realized, like, you know what, we can forge relationships in this way. We can actually make a difference with people that we've never met before. And so although this was a theme that I noticed quite a bit and that we noticed as a group quite a bit with these interviews, I think it'll change. I actually think it'll be different. And we'll talk a little bit about sort of these different timelines within the pandemic and how they might relate to the data. But I think it would be interesting that to do these interviews maybe in a couple of months after providers have really had months and months and months of experience doing teletherapy, to see if they feel the same way about some of these relationships. It'll be interesting, at least. And so this last sub-theme was probably the thing, even though it's just a sub-theme, this was probably the thing that came up the very most out of everything in all of these interviews. And that was this idea of coaching. So here's the quote. So I had one child where there was PT and speech involved. So with that, family services looked, the PT and speech, they would be involved with the meetings and trying to coach the family and how to use the physical therapy strategies. So if you can imagine trying to do something like physical therapy via teletherapy, I'll just say it's difficult. So you're actually having to coach a parent, like, how does the body need to move? How do I move this kid, for somebody who's not trained? And so there are a whole lot of examples of these providers saying, yeah, I had to learn how to coach something that it was hard for me to learn, much less teach over the computer. And there were quite a few examples of that as well. All right, so this last one was the post-pandemic predictions. And so we had basically asked questions about, how do you expect things to go at the end of the pandemic? Or maybe if at the closing stages of the pandemic, do you expect some of the things that you're doing to carry over? So we had some examples, some really cool examples. So, hey, we could go 3 times at the school this month. We could do one Zoom so that you can see what we're doing. I can check in with you, the parent, on how the child's doing at home, show you how I'm using or want you to use the materials that I'm sending home, the homework or activity ideas. So this was for somebody, again, who was mostly placed in schools, but was saying, look, like, this Zoom stuff is working. Like, I'm actually getting to see some of the things that go on at home that I normally don't get to see. Maybe we do, 3 times in person, and then we have one Zoom meeting each month or so that I can see how things are going at home and see the child in a different environment. What was really cool about this was we heard this over and over from folks, again, that there was some difficulty as a result of teletherapy, but also kind of like an opening up and an awareness that this is a viable method of therapy, a viable method of providing services. And so maybe it's something that'll stick after the pandemic. This next example was talking about I'll read it to you and then I'll tell you a little bit about it. So during naturally occurring activities, and so why aren't we focusing more on these goals that are doable across a variety of settings and are truly functional and are truly foundational and are truly things that the entire team can be working on with the kid and we can work on at home. And so this is somebody who's saying, look, like we've been focusing in one arena too often. You know, if we focus too much at home, then we're neglecting behaviors that happen at school. If we're focusing too much on school or neglecting the behaviors that go on at home, this pandemic has really allowed us to see that, you know, all of these areas are very important and that we have the potential to make change in all of these areas. So why aren't we doing it? And so this person really felt like this is something that's going to stick. And this was actually a theme too, that a few folks said, but not necessarily as well as the quote that I had in there. And this last one is, I have had some families that it's just not possible to be meeting during a typical workday. So I might shift a couple hours to the afternoon or later evening and not work in the morning or something. So I could shift responsibilities at home a little bit so that those needs can be met, which honestly, I don't know why I don't do that regularly. I think that's an interesting thing that's going to shift. I think the way a lot of us think about our work weeks. And I don't know about you all, but that's a huge thing that I've noticed as a result of the pandemic. And these early intervention providers were noticing too, which is that the 9 to 5, you know, it might work really well for some folks, but especially when you're trying to provide care and sometimes what you need to see is the behavior itself, and the behavior doesn't happen between the hours of 9 to 5. Some of these therapists were saying, yeah, so I could take a morning off. I can, you know, take somebody to a doctor's appointment. I can spend some time on self-care, do whatever I need to do in the morning, recognizing that maybe I'm going to start working with this family between, you know, 6 and 7 p.m. And having that flexibility and recognizing that rather than sort of like ruin the span of the work week that now, oh, I'm working at home, it actually adds to the flexibility of the person there so that they can feel more comfortable taking time off, the provider, and provides services in the times where it's the most relevant and needed for some of these families. And so this was another theme that we heard quite a bit. And I think it's definitely going to be one of the ones that sticks post-pandemic, at least in this field, is that there's going to be a lot more flexibility with when services can be provided, not necessarily that they need to be done earlier or later than like the typical 9 to 5, but just noticing that it's going to be helpful. All right, so I want to cover a couple of other notes just related to the study, and then we'll have some time to get into some questions. One of the significant limitations that we found with this study was just that we were getting to talk to these EI providers who were seeing clients, who were seeing their patients or clients. And so what we didn't get to do was we didn't get a lot of information about, okay, who's declining these services? Like what families are not taking advantage of the teletherapy or being sent materials or sort of being sent like postcard reminders. Those are some of the like creative ways that people were providing interventions. And so we really wanted to know, okay, like who's not accepting these services and for what reasons? And some of the administrators that we talked to actually alluded to some of those questions as well. Is like, it's really great to notice like what was helpful for the families that were willing and able to be engaged in these interventions, who's not doing it, and for equity's sake, like what can we do to make a difference with that? And we'll talk a little bit about that in the future research too. And then lastly, we had this varying pandemic epochs, which was a fancy way of saying that this pandemic has had various stages and various understandings of what's going on, and that in each part, the interviews that we were having were showing up somewhat different. So if you interview somebody in, let's say, May or June about, you know, how are things going? How are you providing services? Maybe they're going to be feeling like, well, we don't know when this is all going to be over. We're going to do this for a short time, like this feeling of like putting a Band-Aid over it, versus when you interview people in August and September, a lot of these folks were like, yeah, we were making some really drastic changes to the way that we provide services because we don't know how long it's going to last. And so depending on when you interviewed somebody, you got different responses. We also found this really interesting dynamic where the people who we interviewed early on were really positive, and they would talk all about like, yeah, we're really excited because again, we're able to reanalyze the way we provide services. We're able to, you know, look at what we're doing. We're being really creative with the way that we're providing services, and flash forward to the people in a couple of months, like we talked to in August, and I think the ones in September were pretty starkly different because it gets tiresome. And there was actually a sense of, and we take notes in each interview, kind of like looking at affect of the interviewee and mood and how they talked about how they were presenting and things like that. And you felt a much more down group of folks in those second group of interviews. And it was mostly just because, you know, it's draining and it takes a lot out of you to be dealing with this for so long. And so kind of even just whether folks were being optimistic or pessimistic changed depending on what time period within the pandemic we had. So if we go forward again, if we were to do interviews in a couple more months after this, we would expect to see some very different things too. So those are some of the limitations, is that we can only catch what we're trying to get during these really specific time points, and they're relevant, you know, spanning other times, but it's still just a snapshot. All right, and then we've got some future research. So again, there was some indication that certain types of services may be prioritized over other services. So I'll tell you what that looked like in these interviews. We had, for instance, we'd have somebody like a social worker who says, look, like I help folks set up doctor's appointments. I help them get in with speech language pathologists. I help them, you know, connect with teachers, you know, provide like food assistance, like all these different things. The social workers we talked to were very rarely was the service declined. These folks that they worked with were like, okay, great. Like anything we can do, that's awesome. Let's do it. Some of the more focused interventions. So again, some examples from like speech language or maybe positive behavior support only, if that's the only thing that was happening, we were noticing that some of those folks talked more about having their services declined during this time period. And we hypothesized that a lot of that's just related to like people trying to figure out their priorities. The hard part is, again, we're just getting a snapshot from these groups of people. And you know, some of them are more well-placed than others, like the administrators were well-placed to kind of provide some of these insights. But the whole point was just, oh, we're noticing this dynamic a little bit. How can we study that in a more significant way? And I think one of the ways we can do that is just getting parent perspectives, right? Is like talking to parents who parents who have their kids involved in these early intervention services, and talk to them about, okay, what services were you accepting, and for what reasons? And then also just talk about like, did that change over time? Was it related to your priorities? So right now, we're just about to get started on some of those parent interviews. We're hoping within the next couple of weeks, we'll have our first one done. And we're planning on looking at some of these ideas about prioritization of services, and you know, what comes up. So with that said, I think that's basically most of my presentation here. I'm finishing a little bit early, but hoping that there will be some questions as well.
And that's great. Thank you, Doug. The timing's just fine.
Okay.
We have quite a few people online, so I'm wondering if anybody has some specific questions for Doug, or if you have some conversation related to this topic. Doug is a fantastic conversationalist. So if you have anything you'd like to talk about or have addressed, now's a great time to do that. So go ahead and put it in chat and we will see what we can do.
And I can stop sharing as well, Melissa. I don't know if that's helpful to see the chat as well.
Yeah, that's okay if you want to.
All right.
Because then you can see the chat.
Yeah.
So far, I don't have anybody with anything. But I put a couple resources in the chat. I put a link for our next webinar. I think we have another one before that, but this one is accommodating brain injury in vulnerable and at-risk populations. So that one is there in the chat. I also linked to some parent resources in the chat.
One other thing I could just speak on briefly is that I kind of mentioned that folks were being creative. Oh, okay, here we go. Let's see, we have a question in chat. So did anyone in the study talk about conducting evaluations via telehealth? And what were the challenges noted? Yeah, that's a great question. Great question. So, and definitely leads into what I was going to talk a little bit about. So we had quite a few people talk about telehealth, and I mentioned sort of this difficulty working with kids individually. What I didn't talk about that was a really interesting outcome of some of the telehealth stuff was that telehealth meant different things to different families. And so for some folks, it was like, oh, we had a Zoom session once or twice a week. It was really regimented. You know, we'd have the child in front of the screen for this period of time, the parent in front of the screen for this other period of time. And that's kind of the way that we did it. But for a lot of the parents too, some of the challenges was literally just like, I don't have a whole lot of experience with Zoom. I don't have a whole lot of experience with this video method. And so I've experienced in other ways. And so for instance, we had folks that would call on the phone regularly and actually provide services strictly by phone. We had parents that wanted to do through text messages mostly, and then by phone periodically. We had one of our providers who actually just was like, you know what, for the people that don't want to do telehealth or are not able to do telehealth, I'm going to go to their house. I'm going to mask up. We're going to follow all of the guidelines, stand the 6 feet away, and we're going to try and do this from the backyard. And we had one or two folks who talked about that as well. And so, yeah, those were some of the kind of the challenges that came up. But again, as a result, people were really creative. One of the more kind of funny examples that we thought of that was unique, but at least two of the professionals talked about, was that they started actually sending like snail mail to their people that they're working with. They would actually send like postcards, they would send like packets and things like that. And what they found was that the kids actually had an opportunity to like open some of that stuff up. And then when they would go ahead and do their intervention, either by phone or like on Zoom or something like that, the kids would always be really excited because like, oh, I got something in the mail. You know, this is something that's like new. Let's talk about it. And it sort of became like a way to frame their conversation for something that was exciting for these kids as well. And so, yeah, I think that kind of speaks to some of the creativity. And then at the same time, looking at some of the difficulties with telehealth, those were the main concerns. The other bit I would say is just that there were at least 2 or 3 of the providers who talked about how basically some folks just don't have access because they didn't have internet on anything other than their phone, for instance, or maybe didn't even have that. And so a couple of at least one of the social workers, I think maybe both social workers actually talked about how part of the advocacy that they did was trying to be able to provide these like iPads, you know, small computers, things like that people could actually use to then engage in the telehealth services. So that was a challenge as well, just related to being there. So let's see, the comment in chat is, yeah, we're finding the same issues regarding technology use by both families and providers and trying to figure it out. Our teachers and providers are sending materials to families via pickup at the local schools. Yep, that works. And that seemed to work really well for some of these folks. They were sending materials out, having people pick it up. Also, we saw a lot with like resources, like online resources. And so normally kind of the way these folks would structure it is they would provide services in person, and then they'd say, hey, if you want more information about that, here are some online resources that you can look at. Well, if you're not providing resources in the same way in person, the way that they were actually doing it was they would send information about the resources, and then even, you know, with being on the phone with somebody while they're actually looking at the resources, and both groups having them up in front of them on a computer, so that, you know, it's not just providing resources and then saying, okay, you can look at it if you want to. It's actually like going through the entire process with them. And some of these families were really appreciative that they didn't have to navigate even these complicated websites on their own, is that part of the services that were provided was just, hey, we're going to do it together if that's the case.
Okay. Any other questions or thoughts? I see some familiar names who I know are doing some of this kind of work. We have some of our liaisons on, Doug, some of our ex-liaisons, some of our TBI team members. I see some folks from some different states that I recognize their names. So looks like Ashley had a comment
All
for
right.
you.
So the comment was, our group of specialists and teachers are using a program called GoGuardian, which has helped us help our students to navigate the services we are trying to provide. That's awesome. Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm talking about, is that, you know, people are finding different ways to actually help people navigate resources, because it's tough to do. It's tough to do. Yeah, the administrators were probably the 2 or 3 that we interviewed were probably the best at talking about like how to actually provide those resources. And the administrators also had a lot of insight about what was helpful for their providers as well. And so they would talk about, look, we'd have these meetings where we basically talked about all the creative interventions that all these providers were doing, and then what worked and what kind of tanked and didn't have any success at all, and then compared the two so that they could come up with like a system that anyone could work on. So part of what we're planning on doing too is some follow-ups with these folks. And then when we write the paper, we can actually add in like, all right, here are some of the implications of what we're talking about, some of the ways that people figured things out. Yeah, curious. So the question is, curious about why or how research would differ in different states. So this was an area that I was pretty new to, so I'll speak to it with my level of understanding. But essentially, the way that early intervention is done in states like Ohio versus Oregon, is you could see some pretty drastic differences. Even as I'm thinking about it, some of the interviews that we did with folks in Ohio were talking about the early intervention services provided were done like only in the school. And they basically, it was like a pre-kindergarten where they were only done, you know, the parent would bring the kid to school, they would do it in that same place, they'd get used to being a part of that kind of environment, and then they would transition up. Versus in Oregon, that it wasn't the same type of situation. And so just where folks were being seen was a really significant difference. Also looking at like what sort of system we're talking about. So rural versus urban scenarios were very different. So the folks that we interviewed from Eugene were going to be really different than the couple interviews that we did in South Oregon. We're going to be different from the folks that we did in like Cincinnati area. And I mean, you'd notice that, okay, people who are used to working more rurally, you know, I can say again, I'll say this is all anecdotal because this is all stuff that we're going to include in the paper, but really they're noticing that there were a lot more creative responses from people who are used to having to be creative already, because they may not be able to get out to each home or each school because they had like kind of like a larger area that they were accessing. And so we saw a lot of differences there as well.
Okay, any other thoughts? I think these have been great questions so far.
Definitely.
Helen says thank you.
Great, no problem. Yeah, and if anyone also, even if you have like follow-up or questions, like you can feel free. I'm pretty sure my email address is on the CBERT website now. So I'm happy to answer any questions about this study or what sorts of things we found out, or even just afterward, even if you need like access to the paper later, I'd be happy to talk about that too. Because I think what's nice about this kind of work is that it was really, really timely, and that it also is a function of like working with researchers who really care about providing like good information that's relevant. So the decisions that were made is that it could have very much been, you know, oh, we've already done all of our research with the advisory board and we know how these interventions are done, so we're just going to go ahead with this tiered online support model and not make any changes. But they really decided, look, the world has changed even over the span of a couple of months. Let's study that a little bit and let's figure out what we can do that makes our service better ultimately.
Okay. Well, I put Doug's email in the chat. It's also on the CBERT website. If you go to cbert.org and you click on, I think it's About Us, and then there's a Meet the Staff, you can see Doug's bio and his email there, but I also just stuck it in the chat. I think all of us at Siebert are always more than happy to answer any questions. And if we don't know the answers, we'll try hard to point you in the right direction. And I think that's where we're going to stop because we don't seem to have any more questions for today. And just so you know, like I said before, there's a link to upcoming webinar also in the chat. If you're looking for more information on a different topic, it's there. Otherwise, thank you everybody for being here today. We will have the recording up and posted soon, along with Doug's slides and handouts. So on that note, have a great day. Happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.